So good to be here in Palm Springs. Thank you for the invite. I was in dreary Durham yesterday.
Durham?
Yeah.
Why were you in Durham?
Speaking to a class at Duke, I cut a deal where I would go do it if they brought me to a basketball game. It's worth it.
It's a good deal.
It's worth it. Best deal I cut. Does everybody know Ben Rhodes? You didn't get booed yet. All right, we'll see. I just want to start by saying, these political books, obviously you've got a lot of folks that come to these things that have written political books, and many of them are very smart, but sometimes they feel kind of like homework, and that they are reciting, what they went through. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to write, I had to go back and reread a lot of it. I didn't have to. I wanted to reread everybody's books. And Ben's, that we're going to talk about today, After the Fall, was one that really stuck with me because it seemed like, you were really deeply reflecting on your experience. And it wasn't just kind of this memoir of, this happened and that happened and that happened, but I was trying to think about my own impressions of my job when I went into the job and what I think about that now, what I've learned. And that influenced me a lot, and I highly recommend it if you haven't read it, just on that regard alone. But I'm just kind of wondering what was the mental process for you like when you thought about writing the book? Why did you want to write it? What did you want to get out of it?
Well, thanks for that, Tim. And your book actually accomplishes that in spades. We didn't plan this before, by the way, but you guys should check out Tim's book. It's very searching, personal, and fun.
If I didn't like it, I would tell you. I promise.
He would actually. Well, for me, the starting point was, this thing happened where after 8 years working in the White House, Donald Trump was elected president. And for me, it was even more disorienting because I was 29 years old when I went to work on the Obama campaign in 2008. And most people don't stay in the White House for 8 years for a good reason, but I did. And so I was 39 on Inauguration Day 2017. And it was literally like being spit out on the other end of some insane wormhole that I had dropped into. And I was dropped into dystopia for me, because everything that we've been doing, everything I've been working on, everything I was proud of, had culminated in this handoff to people that then immediately set about trying to dismantle everything I'd worked on. And so it was a very disorienting experience. And it took me a while to kind of literally catch my breath. I think it would have normally, in even normal circumstances, but given the extremity of what was happening and the stakes that I felt of what was happening, I was very disoriented. I almost have little memory of the early months of 2017. And then I found something interesting, which is when I traveled outside of the United States, what was happening in the United States somehow made more sense to me. It's a bit like being in a dysfunctional family, not that my family has any history of that, but sometimes you have to leave your family to see what's going on in your own house. And so I started to notice some things that some version of the same thing was happening everywhere with democracy and authoritarianism and people's sense of disorientation with the world. And I knew there was something there. Now, I wrote a memoir of my time in the Obama White House that I just did as fast as I could. I wanted to get it out. But in my head, I was like, there's something here about kind of trying to understand what's happening in America by looking at what's happening in other places. And for me, the jumping off point of the book was in early 2018. I was in Germany. I met a guy who's in the Hungarian opposition. He's an anti-corruption activist, which is on some things, it's a good business to be in because there's a lot of corruption in Hungary, but it's not easy to be an opposition to Viktor Orban, who's basically a dictator in Hungary. And I said to him, well, how did this happen? How did you go from being a liberal democracy in 2010 when Viktor Orban got elected to essentially a single-party autocracy now as we're meeting? He said, well, that's simple. Viktor Orban got elected on a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis. He changed the voting laws to make it easier for his supporters to vote and harder for others to vote against him. He packed the courts with far-right judges who would find in favor of his power grabs. He enriched some cronies on the outside who financed his politics, bought up the media, turned it into kind of a far-right propaganda machinery.
You notice some parallels?
He wrapped it all up. He wrapped it all up in a nationalism, us versus them, us, the true Christian Hungarians, against them, the immigrants, the Muslims, George Soros, liberal elites. And I said, okay, this is the book, because there's a different flavor of this happening everywhere. And so that started this journey for me of trying to tell the story about why authoritarianism is on the rise in our country and around the world through the stories of different places.
Yeah, I want to get into those places that you went, but there's one element of the book that, as maybe a wayward conservative, that I kept thinking about when I was reading it. There's this old line that we conservatives like to use to make ourselves feel better, which is the Irving Kristol line about, a conservative is just a liberal who is mugged by reality.
Yeah.
And there was like this element of that in your book, right? Like you felt, you were mugged by reality about as hard as anybody could possibly be mugged by reality. I think Donald Trump, Stephen Miller basically take your old job, like a white nationalist.
Literally, yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
So, did that make you, just kind of talk about what that made you kind of rethink? I'm not saying it made you change your policies, but what did that make you rethink about, the world?
No, I think it's true, and that's why that Irving Kristol quote has endured. And what was weird for me is that I was mugged for a foreign policy person. I'm sure some things didn't work out the way I would have hoped they did around the world, but I really got mugged at home, right? Which is what's interesting. What I really examined, in the book everything all the assumptions I had. And what I had to admit to myself is, you and I are similar age. Like, I was born and kind of came of age politically at the time of kind of maximum triumphalism around America, democracy, the inexorable nature of progress.
Arc of history.
Arc of history. Like, I was, I was first kind of politically conscious in following events through the kind of late 80s and into the Cold War. And it really felt like all of this stuff had happy endings, right? And that was kind of wired into me. Never mind the fact that I was also like a white guy from New York City. And so like if being born at any time in human history with any identity, being a white male American in New York City, coming of age at that time, you are among the most wired to think that things work out. And now there were some intervening events. The thing that propelled me into national security was 9/11. So obviously I witnessed those attacks, so I obviously knew that history wasn't over. But then my first major political campaign on the national stage, I did some local stuff in New York, was Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. And look at how that worked out, And so if I'm honest with myself, I do have to, and I unpack in the book, like this experience of recognizing that that's not how history usually goes. And in fact, when I looked at these, I look at Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, Xi Jinping in China, and then I look at the US, but this kind of strongman politics, tribal politics, nationalism that inexorably leads to war, and we see that now in Ukraine. That's actually the normal story of human history, right? Like, that's what usually happens. Like, countries become more nationalist, a strongman takes over, they demonize the other, and ultimately that autocratic strain at home leads to conflict abroad, and human beings live that cycle over and over and over and over again. And the exception was really this period from the end of World War II to now, essentially. Now, it's not that was perfect. We had the Vietnam War, we had all kinds of things, but we have to correct that, no, this is actually what normally happens, right? Like, Trump seemed really abnormal. No, this is like the normal state of human nature expressed through politics. And so it takes a lot of work to prevent that from happening.
So now, knowing that, let's take you back through the wormhole, and with your bruises of reality, how do you look at your time with Obama, particularly through a foreign policy lens, and think, man, maybe if I was 39 when I'd started this, and Obama was 55, right, and we didn't maybe have quite as much hubris and triumphalism about all of this, might you have done anything differently?
Yes, but what's interesting about it is, and I go through this in the book, as I go through a lot of different pieces of it. For me, it's actually not usually. I could give you a list of things that I didn't like about our foreign policy,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
But for me, the more fundamental thing that again I couldn't have controlled when I was 31 years old coming to the White House, but when I really pulled the thread on what had happened in all these places, what I found, and this is a main theme in the book, was how profoundly impactful the 2008 financial crisis was to global politics, right? In fact, there was one a Hong Kong official. I kind of profiled the Hong Kong protest movement in this book, and I sat down with this anonymous Hong Kong official who met with me kind of quietly at the very end. It was late 2019 of the Hong Kong protest movement. And I said, I'm writing about the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism. What do you think happened? I kind of started there with everybody. And he said, well, that's quite simple. In 2008, the narrative of liberalism and democracy collapsed with the global economy. That's when people in the West started to ask, is globalization really working out for us? And illiberal politicians took advantage of that sentiment and created a politics of grievance. That's opened the door to people like Putin to undermine the global order. And Xi Jinping and the Chinese looked at this and said, well, why do we have to defer to the Americans? For a time they thought the Americans at least were good stewards of the global economy. We can kind of be, we can kind of hitch our wagon to this order that the Americans have built. And after that crisis, they were like, we can challenge these guys. We don't need to bide our time anymore. And I say that not to absolve us of responsibility, but to say that I think we didn't fully appreciate when we came in the scale of disruption that had taken place because of the financial crisis. And so therefore, an Orban, right, who just seemed like an eccentric, weird right-winger in Hungary, we didn't necessarily see this guy's actually trying to undermine the European project, right? Or when you had this feeling of, in this country and around the world, whether it's the Tea Party movement here or all the manifestations of that kind of populism around the world, I think we were slow to realize the extent to which that wasn't a spasm, right? Just because of the financial crisis, it would kind of correct itself once growth was restored.
Yeah, sure.
But that was something that we had to speak to kind of fundamentally. And that was compounded by some of the things that we saw as hopeful, like social media, right? Obama gets elected as the first social media president. These tools then become the tools to destroy democracy through disinformation or through surveillance and monitoring. The Chinese version is surveillance and monitoring. The Russian one is disinformation. And so we didn't do anything to try to curb the excesses of social media. So for me, it's I could go through the foreign policy list, but it's more like a fundamental slowness to appreciate the scale of disruption that was happening around us, which I think if I had to do it over again, you just might have moved quicker in certain areas. I don't know that we could have ever prevented the kind of wave that was building, but we could have built some dams and levees,
walls.
Some walls around it, hopefully.
Okay, I want to go to the macro on this maybe, so this isn't more about specific foreign policies, but listening to all that, I'm wearing my Neocon colored glasses, and I got to the end of your book, and I thought to myself, I think Ben Rhodes might be a closet neocon. I just don't know that he's ready to admit it yet. Because I hear all of that of what you're saying, and that maybe I mean this neocon in the sense of believing that America is a force for good in the world, and that America should be more forward-leaning and their influence on the world, maybe not about the economic side of things. Yeah. Because you're talking to the dissidents in Hong Kong, you're talking to the dissidents in Hungary and these other places, and they're saying, oh, the American narrative is falling apart, and that's allowing this counter-narrative to rise. And each chapter as I go through, the more I hear about these counter-narratives, they're darker and darker, right? I mean, Orban, you explained, Xi is even darker than Orban's. And so it makes it feel like we have this void that we have to fill, right? However imperfect America is, that we're needed because the alternative is so bad. And it did feel like when Obama came in 2008, there was maybe a sense that actually America could kind of pull back a little bit.
Well, I think that That's a really interesting question, Tim. And yes, I have in my DNA.
It's more of a speech than a question.
Yeah,
but
no,
yeah.
but I have in my DNA.
You know where I was going.
I was raised with America as kind of a secular religion in my house, which was a useful middle ground because my mom was a liberal Jew and my dad was a conservative Methodist. So we had interesting dinner table conversations. And my brother's a libertarian who worked at Fox News for 12 years. So when people say, Ben Rhodes, you were in some bubble, I'm like, no, my dinner table was not a bubble. But America was a secular religion, and the belief in what America stood for. I was mugged by reality a couple times. So I'm starting here to explain the Obama mentality coming in. I moved down to Washington to be a part of the response to 9/11. And I'd gone to an Army recruiter that had no idea what to do with a 24-year-old graduate student at NYU in fiction writing. If he had a better pitch the week after 9/11, I would have probably ended up in the military, but they hadn't adjusted yet. They're like, you could learn how to be a computer scientist in the military? And I was like, no, it's all right. So I moved down to D.C. And I really wanted to be a part. I was really rooting for George Bush. I was stirred by his speeches, and I write about this in the kind of cause of America's next great challenge. Iraq, I got mugged by that reality because I remember being like, well, Iraq seems like a weird response to 9/11. And but then all these people I admired, and Colin Powell most profoundly, were like, we must do this, And all the people that knew better than me, just some 24-year-old, they all were for this war. And when that went so badly, I was like, wait a second, maybe these people all don't know what they're talking about. And meanwhile, there's Obama, and I got on the Obama train really early in that Senate campaign because he gave these speeches about this was a mistake. And so the Obama election, Americans, even in 2008, were tired of wars, and they were tired of Iraq, and they were tired of Afghanistan. And so there was a sense that we need to kind of pull back from how far we'd extended ourselves in the war on terror. Now, we could have a long debate about, I never thought that pulling back from the war on terror meant pulling back from everything else. But to fast forward to the other element of your question, I am a very strange creature in the national security establishment in that I moved to the left during my time in government. That's not usually what happens to people in national security, but for a bunch of reasons, except I still fundamentally believe America has this indispensable role to play. And what I'd always say to other people who are further to my left is, if you don't like the American-led order, wait till you find out about the Russian and Chinese-led order, right? And in the book, I talked to Alexei Navalny, is my main Russian character, who's now in a prison cell in solitary confinement in Russia. These Hong Kong protesters who saw their city basically extinguished in terms of its freedoms. The Hungarian opposition that's been grounded up. And what was so interesting is they could give me the bad story about America, right? And Alexei Navalny's story was basically like, when you guys are a mess, he's like, my whole life, and Alexei Navalny's probably be a Republican in the United States, right? But he's like, my whole life, he'd probably write for the Bulwark, actually. My whole life, I've been making an argument that democracy produces better people who are less corrupt. And you guys elected Trump. And now I can't even win an argument with a cab driver, And then he hit Obama, too, just so you know. He said, my whole life, I'd said, these guys are crooks and thieves who only take care of the oligarchs and don't care about the ordinary people. And there you guys are in the United States, and after the financial crisis, all the billionaires got bailed out and richer, and everybody else suffered. And these social media tools that you created are these platforms that, so he can diagnose what's wrong with America. But then what does he look to for inspiration? America. Like he's using the same social media tools that he's attacking. He's using models of community organizing that could have been taken out of the Barack Obama 2008 handbook. Everywhere I went, I found people have, and this is where I'm like neocon adjacent, but not neocon.
Right, there we go.
Like it's not a pure America's right, because if we do it, it's therefore right. This is kind of the Marco Rubio thing. We get to pick, and whatever we do is kind of fundamentally correct because we're doing it. That's not true. We are really complicated. We're a big, strange, diverse country, that has done a lot of things that have led to bad outcomes around the world, but also represents and has done a lot of things that are the lifeline to the Alexei Navalny's and the Hong Kong protesters and Hungarian opposition. And what can we do to be more the better America than the less better America, I think is the ultimate challenge.
Well, so then what do you say to critics then that would be like, well, it seems like sometimes you got the balance wrong? You know, talking about, you know, this quote, it's a good quote, but I forget if it was in the book or in an interview, but you said you have to look squarely at the darkest aspects of what America is in order to fully, truly love what America is supposed to be. I liked that line. But it's sometimes, do you feel like the left spends too much time talking about, you know, the darkest aspects of what America is, and that hurts our ability to kind of win this global narrative over? And how do you balance that, right? It's not, you shouldn't whitewash the bad stuff, but you know, how can you get the balance more right, and so it's more of an inspiration?
I think it's a fundamental question, Tim. And the way I put it is this. You know, the way Obama would try to do this, and I don't know if he always got it right, but I think he was pretty good at it, is he would not say, you know, America is a white supremacist, structurally racist, fundamentally an unequal country that has a foreign policy that doesn't see the humanity in people around the world. Like, you know, he would say, America is so great that our democracy has allowed us to continually correct our imperfections, to combat our structural racism. In other words, he created a space where, if, you know, this is a guy who won Indiana in 2008, right? Where he could say to like a skeptical center-right white voter like the people that he met in Southern Illinois when he was starting out in politics, I'm not asking you to reject your identity. Because this is what the left does wrong. Like, in order to be taken seriously, you have to first reject basically who you are. You know, yeah, this country's terrible, or right, my identity is guilty of all these things. He would say, come with me. Like, what's so great about our country is that we can just keep getting better, you know? And that's something that people want to be a part of. That's something that people want to join. The ending of his famous race speech in the 2008 campaign was about like an elderly black man and a young white community organizer realizing that the reason they were drawn to Obama's campaign was not Obama, it was each other. It created a space where they could do something together to make the country better. And that, to me, is, if we're going to get out of this period of turbulence, it's got to be that kind of message where, no, you don't deny, like Ron DeSantis would, that there's problems in this country, that don't deny there's racism, but you say what America has given us, the gap between the story of all men are created equal and the reality for many people in this country, the work of closing that gap is not just the work of being American, it's great. It's something we should all want to do with our time here, you know? And I think the left gets itself into trouble when they forget that the pursuit of that objective is where the conversation should begin and end, not the repudiation of all that has gone wrong.
Yeah, I love that. I want to move to, I agree. I want to move to, since you've written the book, there's been some green shoots, right? And so I've been interested before we sat down. I was like, I wonder what he thinks now, you know, as compared to, when did it come out, 2 years ago?
Yeah. COVID makes time feel like
time's a flat circle. Time's a flat circle. But you know, I think that the American narrative is looking stronger than it probably did when you wrote the book. You know, and the Chinese management of COVID has been a nightmare internally and globally. The vaccine doesn't work. You know, Bolsonaro lost. Trump lost, the election deniers lost in the midterms. We can think that NATO, kind of this, you know, the NATO alliance is much stronger than it was, obviously, during Trump, maybe even long before that, because of the Russian incursion. So, what do you make of that? And does that, you know, sort of the last 2 years change your thinking from maybe when you'd finished the book?
No, and if anything, what's interesting is that everything is like part of what I think, you know, people want to know, why is everything so crazy now? Why is this so intense? Like, why are politics so crazy here and around the world? I think it's because everybody knows how high the stakes are, right? And look, just in my book, I finished it and turned it in on January 6th. And so that happened. Alexei Navalny got poisoned and almost killed while I was, talking to him as a character, and now is in prison. Hong Kong got swallowed up by the Chinese, and they got away with that. And Putin has invaded Ukraine.
You're saying I'm wrong. In some ways, it's worse than when you
No,
finished
no,
the book.
I'm not. On the other hand, people are much hyper vigilant, and Trump was defeated in 2020, and I actually think the most hopeful election, from my perspective, in the last decade was this midterm.
Yeah.
Because it had nothing to do with anything other than the fact that people are like, this is too much, in Brazil you saw that too, and Zelensky has captured. The reason I think he's resonated so much is he is speaking to what has been missing the last few years, which is we can have, and it's not disconnected from what I was just saying about the story, we can have a civic nationalism that is about, yes, it's about being Ukrainian, but being Ukrainian is also about being a democracy and being a part of a liberal world that is better than what Putin is offering. Not everybody's the same. That's what Trump wants you to believe, right? Everybody's corrupt, everybody's killers, everybody's the same. And so what you see is the dial has turned up for good and bad. Like unthinkable bad things have happened since I finished that book, starting with January 6th and the invasion of Ukraine. But other things have happened too that are really good. And if I'm most hopeful about something, is that everybody is kind of aware that the stakes are what they are. Like everybody's chips are on the table, and we're having the competition now. And to your point about the Chinese and COVID and frankly Putin in Ukraine, one thing autocrats do, and Trump did this on January 6th, is autocrats overreach because there are no checks and balances, and they make mistakes. And what we're seeing is the overplaying of the hand of the autocrats, So I can find, but we're not out of the woods, So I can find the good and bad. Everything has just gotten almost more intense because I think people realize that it's all on the line right now.
Yeah, Fukuyama, who maybe wasn't perfect about the end of history prediction, was prescient about Ukraine. I think was the most bullish person that I listened to and talked to for this same reason. Like the underbelly of autocracies are much weaker than they seem. I was listening to your podcast with Pod Save the World, which I'm a secret listener of, so don't tell anybody. I don't think we're live streaming this. No, I'm just joking. We have this. Despite the fact I've been giving you the business a little bit, we have this coalition now, right? Like we're basically on the same team, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Like there's this uneasy coalition that's true in America with kind of never Trumpers and Democrats, but is really globally true, right? And the coalition is very sprawling, right? I mean, it includes, like, I think you were mentioning on the podcast, Lula, who totally disagrees with us about what we should do in Ukraine. Yeah. Forget Central America. It includes some decently, center-right leaders, in some of these European countries, obviously Merkel, and you could have examples. What's your sense of like how stable that is, how we can best manage that and foster it going forward? Is there an inevitable end date to this where, we all have a divorce?
I think that one really important point is that the people that have come together in this country and around the world, because they realize and feel intuitively that this is a kind of existential moment for democracy, have to make allowance for the fact that we are going to disagree about some things, right? Because we agree about the fundamental thing, there are too many litmus tests, and I think social media has fed this, because if I say something nice about Tim Miller, all my friends on the left could, do you know that Tim Miller once said this about, tax policy or whatever the thing is you might say like, well, I'm talking to Ben Rhodes about democracy. Like, do you realize the Iran nuclear deal was the biggest disaster in the history of the world? And look, we have to realize that if we throw people off the boat, and shrink the people who are in this kind of coalition in defense of democracy, we're going to lose. I was, if you listen to the podcast, one of the things I talked about recently was a lot of my kind of security-minded friends got really frustrated with Germany because they were slow in sending those tanks to Ukraine. And I'm like, look, if you had, in the lifetime of some of your people, been the Nazis and had basically recreated a whole national identity around, we do not do that. We don't fight wars anymore. We certainly don't have German tanks in Ukraine, which is literally the place where they rolled those tanks over. I'm glad that the Germans need to think hard about this. Do I want them to send the tanks? Yes, but it has to be okay. Like going over there and like bludgeoning poor Olaf Scholz to send Leopard tanks to Ukraine, like, yes, we need to get him there, but like we need to get him there on his terms, you know? And so I think across the board, whether we're talking about the domestic coalition that is in defense of democracy or the global coalition, we have to create room for disagreement about certain issues and certain things. I don't, you know who I'm not a fan of around. Yeah, I'm not a fan of the Saudis. I'm not, a fan, you know, like, and well, I don't want them in the coalition, so forget.
Yeah, they're
that.
not in the coalition. We're not
like,
inviting. I'm leaving the party if they get invited in.
But I can't say that anybody who's like got relations with the Saudis is out. You know, like I can't apply a purity test. So I do think that part of what we need to do, like Navalny's a good example. He's a great example. Yeah. And I encourage everybody to watch this documentary, Navalny, where they put the same question I put to him, which is that Navalny early in his opposition to Putin, not in recent years, but early, he would kind of commingle with some pretty ugly guys, like some nationalist far-right Russian guys, because they didn't like Putin. Now, there's a great Anthony Bourdain line where Bourdain goes to a rally, this anti-Putin rally, and has some of these far-right guys, and he says to the guys with, like, why are they in the same rally with these human rights activists? And he's like, well, the human rights activists want human rights, and these guys over here think that Putin doesn't do enough to F the immigrant workers, you know? And okay, but like the point is, there's a point to this, which is that Navalny's gotten, you know, and I've been challenged, how can you put Navalny on a pedestal? He once stood on a stage with these guys, you know? And when Navalny's asked the question, I asked the question of him, he's like, I'm trying to save this country. Like, I need to get this guy out of there. Like, I need anybody that believes that this should not be a corrupt system and that we should, and once we get rid of him and have a democracy, then I can fight these guys, you know? Now, I'm not saying we should have far-right nutcases in our coalition in this country, but the point is that, like, if you look at Alexei Navalny and are like, in 2009, he marched in this rally, and so therefore we should not support him. Well, who are the people that are going to get rid of Putin? Like who? Right. Like you need to create space for people that you
we can't just have Pussy Riot.
They're not going to be president of Russia. You know, yeah. And this is a big issue because I hear people say all the time, like Russia's going to lose. Like Putin's not going to surrender. Like things are not really going to. Ukraine's not going to be secure so long as Putin is there. And I do not think that he's going to like resign in office if like the Donbass falls to Ukraine. You know.
Yeah. To your point, we published in the Bulwark today a advocacy in support of the Iranian protesters. It was signed by Hillary Clinton, Stephen Harper, Thomas Ilves, like conservative and liberal folks from Natan Sharansky. I mean, he said some stuff people are going to be concerned about. You know, Chimamanda Adichie, right? It's all over the map, and that's what we have to do. So I want to spend the last few minutes doing a quick around the world with you, so we can do your response. So let's start with Iran then. You know, what's your sense for the prospects of the protesters and like next steps?
I think that something fundamental is broken in Iran in terms of the government's hold on the people, because it's not just a political revolution. Like in the past, when there have been protests in Iran, it's like people are upset about this election being stolen, or people are upset about the economy. This is a social revolution led by women that is about the core nature of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Like they just don't want to be an Islamic Republic anymore, you know? And I don't think you put that back in a box. Now, I don't think, and I talk to Iranians a lot, like I don't think that means that next week the Iranian regime is going to fall. I do think that it means that there's going to be some kind of evolution in that country over the next several years, like in a deeply contested and almost civil war-like atmosphere, where like I'm, still programmed enough to think that on the back end of that, you're going to have a more tolerant and more democratic system in Iran. Where I probably part company from some people is that I think if we get involved, we should be involved in speaking out in support of the protesters and trying to get internet in there and trying to spotlight their attention. But if we take it upon ourselves to militarily remove that regime, I actually don't think that is the right way for this to end. Because then it creates, what we just lived through in Afghanistan. Then the hardliners become the resistance to the foreign domination, and I think we have to do whatever we can to help the Iranian people do this themselves.
I don't think we're going to part ways on that one, but maybe on the next two. So let's move around the world. What about threats facing Taiwan? I mean, you talked that wasn't really as much part of your work, but Hong Kong was. So I think that there are a lot of lessons, right, with how Hong Kong got swallowed up. Like, what's your assessment of, how the Taiwanese and the Chinese are looking at what's happening in Ukraine, whether that affects the potential military action by China there, and what you think our role might be should that threat become more real.
So I had such a powerful experience writing about Hong Kong, and I hope you guys pick up the book for a lot of reasons. But one is the Hong Kong chapters were so deeply moving because the young people that I kind of met up with and became my guides, they weren't like the leaders of the protest. And it's interesting, and in Navalny I picked the leader. They were just young people who were like, they felt something slipping away. They felt their identity slipping away. And I sensed immediately after the end of that story that Taiwan was next and deeply impacted by what had happened in Hong Kong and in Ukraine. So I just went to Taiwan, and I have a long piece in The Atlantic on this now. And I met President Tsai, the president of Taiwan, but I also found a cast of young people. And I'm capable of changing attitudes because when I went, they're like, the Atlantic editors were like, you have to ask them about, how has Ukraine impacted them? And I was like, are we just imposing our construct that they're the next Ukraine? But sure enough, I'm sitting with a young, gay, civil society activist. And this is a country, by the way, is the only Asian country that's legalized same-sex marriage. It's a fascinating mix of progressive politics and kind of, hardline anti-China politics. But, and I said, well, how have you been impacted by Ukraine? And he said, when we saw that happen, we were bombarded immediately by all this Chinese disinformation campaigns that all basically said, you're next. And the Americans will never save you. And when the Americans started arming the Ukrainians, the disinformation wasn't like, oh, we were wrong, the Americans did save the Ukrainians. It was like, see what the Americans are doing in Ukraine? They're fighting to the last Ukrainian. They're going to do the same thing to you. You're all going to die fighting against us and losing. And then he teared up and he said, but then we all saw Zelensky. And we never realized that one person could change the course of history like that.
Wow.
And this guy is now like getting military training on the weekends. Now, I hope he doesn't have to use it. But everywhere I went, they had been stirred to like, we will not give up what we have. And the president of Taiwan, who is not Zelensky, he's a wonderful leader, but very reserved woman. But she had like a steely thing of like, we want to defend ourselves. All we're going to ask you is to help us defend ourselves. And we want to be worthy of that support. And so I absolutely think that we should be doing everything we can to help the Taiwanese. I reject, and this is, I'm speaking to your Neocon heart, I reject this idea that, Nancy Pelosi can't travel there. And I know all the reasons that all my friends would give. About,
I forgot that. I texted you and you said that on the pod. I was like, yeah, man.
Because you know what? This is part, and this is where I'm going to be a little like, I'll speak a language you like. Like, you want to know why I fault us in the Obama administration and I fault successive American administrations? Why do we self-censor? The Chinese don't self-censor how they talk about us. Watch Chinese state media and hear what they say about our politics. But we're super careful about how we talk about Tibet or how we talk about Hong Kong or can Nancy Pelosi go. If Nancy Pelosi or any one of you in this room want to travel to Taiwan, why should we not go? Because that offends the Chinese. Yeah. That is giving them a veto over like our own actions, never mind Taiwan's. And what I worry about, though, is I am not convinced that the United States would go to war with China on behalf of Taiwan unless we can collectively make a political decision to take that step. I would not want to lead the Taiwanese to believe, the Fifth Fleet or the Seventh Fleet will be there, like this. So I think in the interim, we have to be doing everything we can to get them. And what they say is, the faster you arm us and train us, the harder the Chinese will have to think twice about doing something.
Yeah.
That to me feels like the right course. What I don't agree with is Mike Pompeo going over there and saying, we should recognize Taiwan as an independent nation tomorrow, because that's us choosing to force the issue, right? The Taiwanese should decide, and I think what they're likely to decide is let's just try to avoid this and wait out the Chinese and see if something changes,
Another agreement, you could have written that for the bulwark. So, okay, I'm going to find a disagreement. I think Biden has done almost a really quite a good job in foreign policy. I think the one area where our narrative that we're going to stand with you and we're going to stand with people who have threats to their deep threats to their freedom, where that narrative cracked was Afghanistan. I thought the pullout from Afghanistan was a nightmare, and that it was operationally handled poorly. It sent the wrong message to people in countries that want to help us, our allies, the translators, all the folks in Afghanistan that spent 2 decades helping us. What is your it doesn't feel like the Biden administration wants to own up to that at all and really brush it off. What's your sense for whether that had any impact on all this conversation around the world beyond the obvious impact on the women and people living in Afghanistan?
Here's the impact it had, because there are 2 things, and I'm going to do something I used to hate when I was in government, and now I get to do it because I'm not in government anymore. Because I'm going to say the idea that we needed to get Americans withdraw from Afghanistan completely at some point, and I'm not suggesting on the kind of artificial September 11th timeline, is something I agree with. And I'll come back to why in a second. The way we did it and the speed with which we did it and the kind of seeming callousness, I don't want to, I don't think they're callous people in the Biden administration, but we knew that we knew who had to get out. Right. We knew who the translators were. We knew who the civil society was. We knew who the women who would be in danger were. And we just really didn't start trying to get them out until the last week when everything started collapsing. What that's done, where that's hurt us, I don't think it's hurt us from some strategic position, because the reality is actually being out of Afghanistan has made it a lot easier for us to support Ukraine. Because if you talk to the people in government, we're giving all of our small arms, all of our stocks, all this stuff is going to Ukraine, to the point that we're having to replenish our own stocks. In fact, it's hard to get Taiwan what they need because we're sending so much to Ukraine. And a lot of that stuff that we're sending was in Afghanistan. That said, and this is a progressive argument against what we did in Afghanistan, the message that's been taken from all that around the world is, you don't care about brown people. You care about the Ukrainians because they're white.
Interesting.
And when people ask, well, why, the world is not united on Ukraine. I always hear the whole world is united. The whole world is not. All of Europe and the United States and Japan and Canada are on board. But, everybody else is buying Russian oil. Everybody else is busting sanctions. Nobody else is speaking up against the war, really, in Africa and Asia and most of Latin America. And I think part of that is this feeling that this is a big old double standard. And you guys, didn't value the lives of these people that had sacrificed for you. And then you kind of blamed them. I mean, the thing that administration, I think, that I really didn't agree with is messaging of, well, it's the Afghans' fault. They didn't fight. Well, we built their military, and I'm in part of the collective, to only be able to operate with U.S. tail support, U.S. contractors, U.S. resupply. So once we take all that away, are we surprised that these guys are well, I can either fight the Taliban and have them go kill my mother and sister at home, or I can go home and try to blend in with my mother and sister. They should have kept Bagram open. They should have gotten more people out and done this on a longer timeline. I still think, though, at the end of the day, we did need to leave that country. And so I don't fault the decision. But I think the way that went about has caused problems.
Okay, we only have 1 minute left. I asked. So I'm going to give you one easy one hard one, 30 seconds each. I'm putting a quarter in. How scared should we be about the Saudis and MBS, and how awful is what they're doing with their global influence?
I think I'm very scared, because this is a guy with trillions of dollars, bottomless wealth, and he knows that wealth can buy influence and can shut people up or bring people to his side. The reason he does a live golf tour, the reason he does all these things is he wants to prove that we care more about money than values. And if that's not true, then we should not take that money, and we should not be chasing like a sociopath with $1 trillion around for his support.
Amen. All right, I asked your colleague. Amen. Yeah, let's clap for that. Amen. John, I asked John Favreau to give me one hard question for you. So here we go. 25 seconds from John Favreau. Say one nice thing about Bibi Netanyahu.
He's a very effective troll. Yeah.
We could do another hour on Israel down the line. I'm letting you off the hook. Thank you all so much for coming. So great to be here. Thanks, Ben. Get after the fall.